That is one big pile of shit.
For the last several years, remakes have been being made for older titles. If done well, this allows older games to shine again. We saw this with the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro collection sets. These PS1 classics were given new life with visual remakes, and it gave them a nice coat of paint and released on modern consoles. The recent Resident Evil remakes allowed for a modernization of some of the beloved PS1 games. Along with this, these remakes do not replace the PS1 classics, but rather stand next to them as the same game and situation executed with modern mechanics. And in some cases, these remakes can allow for a classic like Mafia 1 to now be experienced again with visuals and gameplay built from the ground up specifically for the remake. In all of the examples I presented, the developers cared about the projects they were working on, and they had the talent to deliver on the quality established by the originals. You can see this just through the execution of these titles. There's a respect there that can be seen in the final game that shows that these developers were trying to get the remakes right. You can also see when a company or publisher has little interest in making a quality game and is only focused on making a quick buck. When the remake for 13 was announced, I was pleasantly surprised. The original was an underrated title that could definitely use updates in certain areas. The original delivered an interesting story, fun shooting, and a captivating visual style. Sadly, this remake to 13 is one of the worst and passionless remakes I have played in a long time. It feels lazy and undercooked. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my review for the remake to 13. When a game can hook you out of the gate, it deserves praise. Some take a while to really hook the player. In some cases, the beginning events are a bit rocky, while in other cases, there's just a slow build up to it. The original 13 is an example of a game that grabs you right out of the gate. The original used a combination of slick presentation that takes heavy inspirations from comics along with a mystery. Along with this, it does not take long to get into the action, and that comic book style carries over into the gameplay. The remake is telling the same story, but the talent in the execution is not present. When you start the remake, you are greeted by an FBI agent watching parts of the intro from the original game. I thought this was going to serve some purpose and maybe having some winks and nods with the FBI agent commenting on it, or how it is just plain silly to have a character in the game essentially watching the original game. There was a lot of directions that the developers could have taken this. I found it odd that I was watching a character essentially watching the first game, but once the cutscene concludes, the agent just walks off and now we are on the beach section. What was the point of this entire section of the game? Were the developers attempting to pay respect to the original's opening by simply just playing that intro? This was not respectful at all, and it felt lazy. The intro in the remake felt like the developers wanted to shortcut the opening by showing what is essentially old footage for their new game. My guess is this way they did not need to remake all of the cutscenes in their new engine. I do not know what the intent was. Like I said, this feels lazy and like the developers of the remake wanted to cut corners to save on time and resources. What is worse is this is how the remake starts. This is the first thing that you are introduced to before you get into the game. All the slick execution and mystery of the original is lost on this insulting intro. Also, it doesn't make any sense to have an FBI agent watching the intro from the original game. If the developers were going to do something like this, the execution of it needed to be better. An example of doing something like this right can be found in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. The opening to the original sets the tone for what they want to show us along with the excellent music. The remake opts to show us different sections of Midgar along with conveying the same tone as day turns to night. The final part of the remake's opening is where the intros link up. This is the right way to do something like this. The remake to 13 is wrong in every way. And honestly, this intro is an example of the talent and quality that can be found throughout the entire remake, or lack thereof it.
The helicopter. I remember. Ow. My head.
Sir, can you hear me?
After the lazy introduction, we are finally greeted to the first level. Here we get a nice view of the bland art style, bad voice acting, and sloppy shooting. One of the most impressive aspects about the original 13 were the impressive visuals. The game does look dated today, but the execution and comic book style is timeless. When the original was made, cel shading was very popular and it fit very well with the comic style. But beyond looking like you were playing a live-action comic book, the game would use its cutscenes in interesting ways to give it that unique feel. For the most part, this is gutted in the remake. The cel shading is gone, and in its place is a very bland art style. Since the visuals were part of the identity of the original, this again speaks to the developers of the remake not understanding or appreciating what the original accomplished. I haven't even played the game yet, and I was already disappointed with the lack of respect for the original. This is not how you start your game, nor is this how you want to start a remake for an underrated title. 13 is a first-person shooter that combines melee elements, stealth, and some gadgets to keep things interesting. If you are playing on consoles, the aiming sensitivity is really high, and this makes the initial aiming of your guns jarring. The weapons themselves have some decent sound effects, but the impact is minimal, which results in lackluster shooting. The shooting takes up most of the gameplay, and with this feeling lackluster, it makes you wonder why this game was even pushed out in its current state. The first game that I came across to shoot showed me everything that I needed to know about the AI in this game. I understand that most games have dumb to average AI, but this enemy AI definitely could win a prize for how bad they are. The AI's movements and actions completely ruins any intensity you would feel from the shooting. I was shocked how this initial enemy was shooting at me and then decided to run away like he completely forgot that I was there. I have several other situations where the AI would not even react to me shooting them or even try to shoot me back after I shot them. And what made it hilarious was how they were staring at a wall the entire time. One thing you probably noticed by now are the horrible death animations. In many cases, you will shoot enemies and they will sort of fumble their way through their animations before they get to their death animation. This would sort of feel at home in a game where you are playing within a computer program and the system was glitching or bugging out. But that isn't the case here. Here we have a game that was made with very little talent or care. This stuff is laughably bad, and in many cases these death animations fall into the so bad it's good territory with how funny they are. On top of this, the dead enemy faces are just priceless. I played about an hour of this remake and I couldn't take any more. When this originally released, it was in a worse state with constant crashing and frame rate issues. I played the PS4 version on the PS5 but did not experience any of this. But I did have constant screen tearing. This is heavily present within the cutscenes, which is again an insult to the original's great presentation. The 13 Remake is easily one of the worst games I have played from 2020. It is lazy in its execution and disrespectful to the original. The remake's introduction is a great example of the quality quality present throughout the entire game. By just having a random character sit down and watch the introduction from the original for their introduction, this is one of the highest forms of laziness that I have seen in a game. This would be like me re-uploading the original's intro on my YouTube channel and saying that I made this. Honestly, if the rest of the game was not so bad, I could see this intro as the developers trying to pay respect to the original. Maybe not in the best way, but at least trying. But the rest of this game has the same level of laziness to it. This remake was a huge missed opportunity. The original 13 was an underrated game when it was released, and this remake was a great opportunity to give that game a second chance of getting more attention. But instead, we got a developer and a publisher that had no interest in paying respects to the original. The voice acting lacks any urgency or talent, especially from the main character. The gunplay is lackluster with awful AI to fight, and the odd death animations are pretty funny. The game is a complete waste of time, and I would recommend you never try it. One thing that I started doing for my G.I. Joe review was that I wanted to try and provide an alternative game to recommend to people if I end up reviewing a bad game. To go in line with remakes, I felt like this was another great opportunity to bring up the Mafia 1 remake. This ended up being a quality game that actually felt like the developers loved the original and wanted to retain that quality in their game. The original Mafia is a timeless classic for its rich story and characters, but the gameplay and visuals are dated. The remake stays pretty close to the original with its story and adds some more development to characters who didn't have as much in the original, like with Tommy's wife Sarah. This is a story-focused single-player game that is set within a gorgeous city. This is not an open-world game in the traditional sense. You do have a fully made city to drive around in, but all of the gameplay is centered around propelling the narrative forward. This is a linear single-player experience set in an open space. The new engine can be a looker at times, and the soundtrack is pretty great as well. The majority of the gameplay is centered around third-person shooting. The shooting mechanics are pretty much lifted from Mafia 3, so the shooting is vastly improved from the original game. The driving is solid as well, and it might be the best driving within the entire franchise. Mafia is an underrated series that could always use more eyes on it and more love. If you have never played a Mafia game before, or just never played the original, then I would highly recommend you check out Mafia Remake, especially over the awful 13 remake. And thank you very much for watching.